I'm Colonel Maria Martinez, 71, standing in the back of my nephew's college graduation ceremony, wearing civilian clothes and watching my family celebrate his achievements while having no idea that the damaged aunt they've worried about for 4 decades is actually one of the highest-ranking female veterans in American history. They still see me as the broken woman who came back from Vietnam and never quite recovered, the family member they speak about in whispers and handle with careful kindness. Tonight, when the university's keynote speaker, a VA director, recognizes me in the crowd and announces my service record to 20,000 people, everything my family believes about strength, healing, and what it means to survive trauma is about to change forever. Before I tell you how one moment shattered 45 years of misconceptions, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because this story proves that sometimes the people we think are broken are actually the ones holding everyone else together. Growing up as Maria Santos in East Los Angeles in the 1950s meant understanding your place in a world that had very specific expectations for Mexican-American girls from working-class families. My father, Eduardo Santos, worked double shifts at the steel plant to support our family of 7 children. My mother, Carmen, took in laundry and watched neighbors' children to contribute what she could to our household income. Success in our family was measured by stability, respectability, and staying close to the community that had raised you. My 5 brothers were expected to work hard, stay out of trouble, and hopefully find steady jobs that would allow them to support families of their own. My younger sister Rosa and I were expected to be good students, help with household responsibilities, and ultimately marry men who would provide the security our parents had fought so hard to achieve. But from my earliest memories, I was drawn to challenges that extended beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood and the conventional expectations for young women in our community. I was fascinated by current events, particularly the growing conflict in Southeast Asia that dominated news coverage throughout my teenage years. While my friends focused on fashion and dating, I found myself reading news magazines and asking questions about American foreign policy that made my teachers uncomfortable. The Vietnam War was a distant reality that seemed both urgent and abstract to a teenager growing up in Los Angeles. We knew boys from our neighborhood who had been drafted, and we heard stories about the intensity of the fighting, but the conflict felt like something that happened to other families, other communities. My perspective changed dramatically during my senior year of high school, when my brother Miguel was drafted and deployed to Vietnam as an infantry soldier. Suddenly, the war wasn't an abstract news story. It was a daily source of anxiety that transformed our family's daily routines and emotional landscape. Miguel's letters home described experiences that were impossible for our family to fully understand. He wrote about the complexity of fighting an enemy that often looked like the civilians he was supposed to protect, about the difficulty of maintaining morale in a conflict where progress was impossible to measure, and about the bonds he had formed with fellow soldiers who were also far from home and struggling to make sense of their mission. But his letters also revealed gaps in support systems that seemed fixable if the right people were paying attention. He wrote about wounded soldiers who weren't receiving adequate medical care, about mental health challenges that were dismissed or ignored by commanding officers, and about the difficulty of maintaining communication with family members who couldn't understand what he was experiencing. Reading Miguel's letters, I began to understand that military service, particularly in a complex conflict like Vietnam, required not just physical courage but also systemic support that seemed inadequate to meet the challenges that soldiers were facing. This realization coincided with changing opportunities for women in military service. The Women's Army Corps had been integrated into the regular army, and nursing programs were actively recruiting women who wanted to serve in medical capacities. For the first time in American history, young women could pursue military careers that went beyond traditional support roles. The decision to enlist was not one I made lightly or quickly. It required months of research, conversations with military recruiters, and ultimately a family discussion that was more difficult than any I had ever initiated. Mija, my father said when I first mentioned my interest in military nursing, war is no place for a young woman. You've seen what it's doing to Miguel. Why would you want to put yourself in that kind of danger? Papa, Miguel's letters talk about wounded soldiers who need medical care. There are women serving as nurses in Vietnam, helping to save the lives of men like Miguel. I want to be part of that effort. My mother was more direct in her opposition. Maria, you have opportunities here that previous generations of women in our family never had. You could go to college, become a teacher, marry a good man, and raise children who will honor our family name. Why would you choose to go to a war zone when you could build a good life here? The conversation continued for weeks, with family members, friends, and community leaders all weighing in on the wisdom of my decision. Some admired my desire to serve, but most were concerned about the physical dangers and psychological challenges that would accompany military service in a combat zone. But I had made my decision based on a combination of factors that felt more compelling than the alternative paths available to me. I wanted to serve my country during a time of national crisis. I wanted to use whatever medical skills I could develop to help wounded soldiers. And I wanted to challenge myself in ways that would test every aspect of my character and capabilities. 6 months after my high school graduation, I enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps and began basic training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. The experience was everything I had expected and nothing I had prepared for. Physically demanding, emotionally challenging, and utterly unlike anything in my previous experience. Military training in the late 1960s was designed to prepare soldiers for the specific challenges of combat in Vietnam, with an intensity and focus that reflected the urgency of an ongoing conflict. We learned to function under extreme stress, to make medical decisions with limited information and resources, and to maintain professional effectiveness while dealing with casualties that would challenge the most experienced medical professionals. The nursing training was particularly rigorous, combining advanced medical education with military protocol and emergency medicine techniques. We learned to treat trauma injuries that were common in combat situations, to manage pain and infection under field conditions, and to provide psychological support to wounded soldiers who were often dealing with injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. But the most important part of my military training was learning to function as part of a team that included people from backgrounds, regions, and belief systems that were completely different from my own. My fellow nurses came from small towns in the Midwest, urban areas on the East Coast, rural communities in the South, and suburban neighborhoods across the country. Working effectively with this diverse group required communication skills, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to find common ground with people who had very different perspectives on everything from politics to religion to family structures. These skills would prove invaluable during my deployment to Vietnam, where effective teamwork could mean the difference between life and death for the patients we treated. I was deployed to Vietnam in March 1969, assigned to the 12th Evacuation Hospital in Siu Chi, about 25 miles northwest of Saigon. The hospital was located in what was considered a relatively secure area, but secure in Vietnam was a relative term that could change quickly based on enemy activity and strategic developments. The 12th EVAC was a busy medical facility that treated everything from routine illnesses and minor injuries to complex trauma cases that required immediate surgical intervention. We saw soldiers who had been wounded by small arms fire, injured by improvised explosive devices, affected by diseases that were common in the tropical environment, and struggling with psychological challenges that were often more difficult to treat than physical injuries. My first week at the hospital was an education in the realities of combat medicine that no training program could have fully prepared me for. The pace was relentless, with medical personnel working 12-hour shifts that often extended longer when casualty loads were heavy. The cases were more severe and complex than anything I had encountered during training, requiring medical decisions that had immediate life or death consequences. But the most challenging aspect was the emotional weight of treating young men who were often the same age as my brothers, who came from communities similar to mine, and who were dealing with injuries and trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Learning to provide professional medical care while maintaining the emotional resilience necessary to function effectively required a kind of strength I hadn't known I possessed. The breakthrough in my effectiveness as a combat nurse came after about 6 weeks in country, when I was assigned to work with Major Patricia Henderson, a career Army nurse who had developed innovative approaches to trauma care under field conditions. Major Henderson had served in Korea and had spent years refining medical techniques that could save lives in situations where conventional hospital procedures weren't possible. "Lieutenant Santos," she said during my first day working under her supervision, "combat nursing isn't just about applying medical knowledge. It's about adapting that knowledge to situations that constantly change, often in ways that no textbook could anticipate. The soldiers who come through here need medical care, but they also need to see strength and competence in the people treating them." Under Major Henderson's mentorship, I learned to manage multiple critical patients simultaneously, to make treatment decisions with incomplete information, and to provide psychological support to wounded soldiers who were dealing with trauma that extended beyond their physical injuries. More importantly, I learned to see patterns in the medical challenges we were facing that suggested systematic problems requiring administrative and policy solutions. Many of the soldiers we treated had injuries that could have been prevented with better equipment or training. Others had psychological symptoms that were dismissed or inadequately treated by commanding officers who didn't understand the realities of combat stress. These observations led me to begin documenting medical cases and treatment outcomes in ways that went beyond the standard reporting requirements. I started keeping detailed records of injury patterns, treatment effectiveness, and patient outcomes that could be used to improve medical protocols and prevent future casualties. "Santos," Major Henderson said after reviewing some of my documentation work, "you have an unusual combination of clinical skills and analytical thinking. Have you considered pursuing advanced military education that could allow you to influence medical policy at higher levels?" The suggestion opened possibilities I hadn't considered. Military medicine wasn't just about treating individual patients, it was about developing systems and protocols that could improve outcomes for thousands of soldiers across multiple conflicts and situations. 6 months into my deployment, I was promoted to first lieutenant and given additional responsibilities for managing patient flow and coordinating with other medical facilities in our region. The position required administrative skills, strategic thinking, and the ability to communicate effectively with senior officers who were making decisions that affected medical operations across South Vietnam. But the assignment that would define my military career came during my second year in Vietnam, when I was selected to join a special task force developing new approaches to treating what was then called combat exhaustion but would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The task force was led by Colonel James Morrison, a psychiatrist who had recognized that the psychological casualties of the Vietnam conflict were as significant as the physical injuries, but that military medicine was inadequately prepared to address mental health challenges that didn't fit conventional categories. "Lieutenant Santos," Colonel Morrison told me when I was assigned to his team, "we're seeing psychological injuries that are as real and as debilitating as gunshot wounds, but we don't have effective treatment protocols. We need medical professionals who can think beyond conventional approaches and develop innovative solutions to problems that previous conflicts didn't present." Working with the psychiatric task force exposed me to aspects of military medicine that challenged everything I thought I understood about healing and recovery. We were treating soldiers who had experienced trauma that went beyond physical injury, men who had witnessed atrocities, who had been forced to make impossible moral choices, who had survived situations that would challenge anyone's psychological resilience. But we were also discovering that many of these soldiers could recover and return to effective service with proper treatment and support. The key was developing therapeutic approaches that addressed the specific psychological challenges of combat trauma while maintaining the military discipline and unit cohesion that were essential to operational effectiveness. My role in the task force involved documenting treatment outcomes, developing screening protocols to identify soldiers at risk for psychological casualties, and creating training programs that could help officers recognize and address mental health challenges before they became disabling. The work was some of the most meaningful I had ever done, but it was also emotionally exhausting in ways that were difficult to explain to family members who couldn't understand the nature of what I was experiencing. In letters home, I would write about helping wounded soldiers without describing the specific injuries or psychological trauma that defined so much of my daily work. My family's letters in return focused on news from home, questions about my safety, and encouragement to stay strong during what they understood to be a difficult deployment. But their understanding of what I was experiencing was necessarily limited by my inability to share the details of medical cases that were often classified or too disturbing to describe to civilians. The disconnection between my daily reality and my family's understanding of that reality would become a defining feature of my military career and my post-service relationships with people who hadn't shared similar experiences. After 18 months in Vietnam, I was rotated back to the United States and assigned to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where I continued working on trauma treatment protocols while pursuing advanced education in military medicine and psychiatric nursing. The transition from combat zone to stateside assignment was more difficult than I had anticipated. The intensity and urgency of medical work in Vietnam had created a sense of purpose and adrenaline that was difficult to replicate in a conventional hospital environment. More challenging was the realization that many of the innovations we had developed for treating combat trauma weren't being implemented in stateside military medical facilities. At Walter Reed, I encountered wounded veterans who were receiving inadequate treatment for psychological injuries that could have been addressed with the techniques we had developed in Vietnam. The disconnect between what we knew worked and what was actually being practiced suggested systemic problems that required policy changes at the highest levels of military medicine. This recognition led me to pursue advanced education that would allow me to influence military medical policy more directly. I completed a master's degree in psychiatric nursing and a second master's in health administration, focusing on the intersection of clinical practice and administrative decision-making. The combination of clinical experience and administrative education positioned me for assignments that involved developing and implementing medical policies for the entire Army medical system. By my 10th year of service, I was working at the Pentagon, developing protocols for treating combat trauma that would be used in medical facilities worldwide. But my family's understanding of my career remained limited by their inability to comprehend the scope and significance of what I was doing. When I would visit home on leave, conversations about my work would focus on general questions about military life rather than on the specific medical and administrative challenges that defined my professional responsibilities. "How's work going, Mija?" my mother would ask during family dinners. "Busy but good, Mama. I'm working on projects that I think will help soldiers get better medical care." "That's nice, dear. Are you meeting any nice men? You're not getting any younger, and we worry about you being alone in the military." The assumption that my military career was a temporary phase that would eventually give way to marriage and family responsibilities was shared by most of my extended family. They were proud of my service but couldn't envision military medicine as a long-term career that would provide the same satisfaction and security as conventional family life. The misunderstanding became more pronounced as I advanced through senior officer ranks and took on responsibilities that required frequent travel, long hours, and total commitment to mission objectives that couldn't be easily explained to civilians. By my 15th year of service, I was Lieutenant Colonel Martinez. I had married briefly to a fellow officer, but the marriage had ended when our careers took us to different assignments, and was serving as Chief of Psychiatric Services for a major military medical center. The position required managing a staff of 50 medical professionals, overseeing treatment for thousands of military personnel and their families, and developing policies that would influence military mental health care for decades. It was work that utilized every aspect of my education, experience, and leadership capabilities. But when I would describe my responsibilities to family members, their responses suggested that they saw my career as evidence of dedication rather than achievement. "Maria works so hard," my sister Rosa would tell relatives. "She's devoted her whole life to taking care of other people. I just hope she finds time to take care of herself." The comment was well-intentioned but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what I was actually doing. I wasn't just taking care of other people in a general sense. I was developing and implementing policies that would improve mental health outcomes for military personnel across the entire Department of Defense. But explaining the strategic importance of military mental health policy to family members who had no frame of reference for understanding federal bureaucracy or military medicine was nearly impossible. It was easier to let them maintain their benevolent misunderstanding than to constantly defend the significance of work they couldn't appreciate. The pattern continued throughout my military career, which culminated with promotion to colonel and assignment as Director of Mental Health Policy for the Department of Veterans Affairs. The position represented the highest level of responsibility for veteran mental health care in the entire federal government, with authority over programs that served millions of veterans and billions of dollars in annual funding. In this role, I was responsible for developing policies that would shape veteran mental health care for generations, managing relationships with Congress and other federal agencies, and overseeing research programs that were advancing the understanding of combat trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. The work was the culmination of everything I had learned during my military career, combining clinical experience, administrative expertise, and policy development in ways that could improve outcomes for veterans who were struggling with psychological injuries similar to those I had treated in Vietnam. But my family's understanding of this work remained limited by their continued perception of me as someone who had been changed by military service in ways that made conventional civilian life difficult for me. Maria has always been different since she came back from Vietnam, I overheard my mother telling a neighbor during one of my visits home. She never married, never had children, never settled down the way we hoped she would. The war changed her in ways that we're still trying to understand. The comment was painful because it revealed how little my family understood about the choices I had made and the satisfaction I had found in my military career. I hadn't avoided marriage and family because I was damaged by military service. I had chosen a career path that required total commitment and provided meaning that I couldn't find in conventional civilian life. But explaining this to family members who saw my unmarried, childless status as evidence of psychological damage was impossible without seeming defensive or dismissive of their concerns. The misunderstanding reached its peak during my final years of active duty, when I was working on what would become the most significant achievement of my career, developing the comprehensive mental health program that transformed how the VA approached PTSD treatment and veteran suicide prevention. The program I developed integrated everything I had learned about combat trauma during my career, combining clinical best practices with policy innovations that addressed systemic barriers to effective treatment. The result was a comprehensive approach to veteran mental health that reduced suicide rates, improved treatment outcomes, and became a model for mental health care worldwide. The program's success was documented in medical journals, recognized by Congress, and implemented in veterans' medical facilities across the country. It represented the culmination of 30 years of work and would affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of veterans for decades to come. But when I tried to explain the significance of this achievement to my family, their responses suggested that they saw it as evidence of my continued dedication to work that had consumed my life rather than as a professional triumph that had achieved objectives most people only dream of accomplishing. "We're proud of your dedication, Maria," my brother Carlos said during a family gathering, "but we worry that you've spent so much time taking care of other people that you never learned to take care of yourself." The comment encapsulated everything frustrating about my family's perception of my career. They saw my professional achievements as evidence of self-neglect rather than self-actualization, as proof that military service had damaged me rather than developed me. But challenging their perception would have required explaining concepts about military medicine, federal policy, and veteran care that were beyond their experience and interest. It was easier to accept their benevolent concern than to constantly defend choices that had brought me more satisfaction than anything else in my life. I retired from active duty at age 55 with the rank of colonel, transitioning to a civilian position as Director of Research for the National Center for PTSD. The position allowed me to continue the policy and research work that had defined my military career while gaining the flexibility to pursue projects that weren't constrained by military bureaucracy. But my family's perception of my retirement was that I had finally admitted that military life wasn't sustainable and was beginning the process of transitioning to more conventional civilian priorities. "Maybe now Maria can finally relax and think about finding someone to share her life with," my sister Rosa told relatives, as if my 55 years of bachelorhood had been a temporary situation that retirement would finally allow me to address. The civilian phase of my career brought opportunities to expand the research and policy work I had begun in the military, but it also brought continued misunderstanding from family members who couldn't appreciate the significance of what I was accomplishing. Working with the National Center for PTSD, I developed treatment protocols that were adopted by medical facilities worldwide, published research that advanced the understanding of combat trauma, and trained the next generation of mental health professionals who would carry this work forward. But these achievements remained largely invisible to family members who continued to see me as the sister who had never recovered from whatever had happened to her during the war. The misunderstanding was particularly painful during family gatherings, where relatives would speak about my career with the same tone they might use to discuss someone's struggle with chronic illness, proud of my resilience but concerned about the costs of my choices. "Maria has always been so strong," they would say. "She's overcome so much and helped so many people. We just hope she's finding happiness in her work since she never found it in a traditional family." The assumption that my career was compensation for personal failure rather than a source of genuine satisfaction was constant but subtle, expressed through concerned questions about my health, my social life, and my plans for the future. But the research and policy work I was doing during my civilian career was some of the most impactful of my entire professional life. The treatment protocols I developed were reducing veteran suicide rates, improving outcomes for PTSD treatment, and establishing new standards for mental health care that extended beyond military and veteran populations. The recognition of this work came primarily from professional colleagues, medical journals, and policy organizations that understood the significance of advances in mental health treatment. But this recognition remained largely invisible to family members who didn't move in professional circles where mental health policy was discussed or appreciated. The isolation of professional achievement from family understanding had become a defining feature of my life, but it was also something I had learned to accept as the cost of pursuing work that mattered more to me than social validation. This dynamic continued for nearly 2 decades after my retirement from active duty, with my family maintaining their perception of me as someone who had been shaped by military service in ways that prevented me from achieving conventional happiness, while I continued to find deep satisfaction in work that was improving the lives of veterans and advancing the field of mental health care. The moment that would finally bridge the gap between my professional achievements and my family's understanding came unexpectedly, at my nephew David's college graduation ceremony. David was my brother Carlos's son, the first person in our family to graduate from college, and his achievement represented the fulfillment of dreams that had motivated our parents' generation of immigrants. The entire extended family had gathered for the ceremony at UCLA, filling several rows in the graduation arena and representing 3 generations of the Santos family. I had planned to attend the ceremony quietly, celebrating David's achievement while avoiding the kind of attention that might lead to uncomfortable conversations about my own life choices. At 71, I had grown comfortable with my family's benevolent misunderstanding of my career and no longer felt the need to defend or explain my professional choices. The keynote speaker for the graduation ceremony was Dr. Robert Chen, director of the Department of Veterans Affairs, who had been invited to address the graduating class about public service and the importance of using one's education to serve others. Dr. Chen's speech focused on the challenges facing veterans of recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, the importance of developing innovative approaches to veteran care, and the role that young professionals could play in addressing these challenges. As he spoke about advances in PTSD treatment and veteran mental health care, I found myself nodding along with his comments, recognizing references to research and programs I had been involved in developing. But I was completely unprepared for what happened when Dr. Chen concluded his prepared remarks and began to speak extemporaneously about the people who had shaped his understanding of veteran care. "Before I conclude," he said, scanning the audience, "I want to take a moment to recognize someone in this audience who represents everything I've been talking about regarding service and dedication to veterans." The arena fell quiet as 20,000 people waited to see who he was referring to. Somewhere in this audience is Colonel Maria Martinez, retired from the U.S. Army, former Director of Mental Health Policy for the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the architect of the comprehensive PTSD treatment program that has saved thousands of veterans' lives over the past 2 decades. I felt my heart stop as murmurs rippled through the crowd and people began looking around to see who he was talking about. "Colonel Martinez," Dr. Chin continued, "if you're here, would you please stand so we can recognize your extraordinary contribution to veteran care?" The silence that followed seemed to last forever. I could feel my family members looking at me with confusion, unsure whether they had heard correctly or what they were supposed to understand about what was happening. Finally, my nephew David, sitting 2 seats away from me, whispered loudly enough for several rows to hear, "Tia Maria, is he talking about you?" I stood slowly, my legs shaking slightly as 20,000 people erupted in applause that seemed to echo forever in the arena. Dr. Chen was beaming at me from the podium, gesturing for the audience to continue their ovation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said when the applause finally died down, "Colonel Martinez spent 30 years developing the mental health programs that are currently used by every VA medical facility in the country. Her research on combat trauma has been translated into 15 languages and is used by military medical systems worldwide." The audience erupted again, but I was focused on my family members, who were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been awe. More importantly, Dr. Chin continued, "Colonel Martinez represents what it means to serve with quiet dignity, to dedicate your life to others without seeking recognition or acclaim. She is one of the heroes of contemporary veteran care, and I am honored to share this stage with her." As the final applause died down and I sat back down, the area around my family had fallen completely silent. Extended family members were staring at me as if seeing a stranger, trying to process information that challenged everything they thought they knew about me. My brother Carlos was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maria, is what he said true? Are you really Colonel Martinez?" "Yes, Carlos. I am." My sister Rosa reached across 2 other family members to grab my hand, tears streaming down her face. "Maria, we had no idea. We thought you were just working in hospitals, helping individual patients." "I was helping individual patients, Rosa. But I was also developing the systems and policies that helped thousands of other patients across the entire country." The conversation that followed continued through the reception after the graduation ceremony, with family members asking questions about my career that revealed how little they had understood about what I had been doing for the past 50 years. "When you said you were working on projects to help soldiers," my mother said, "we thought you meant you were working with a few people at the local hospital. We didn't realize you were working with the entire government. When you talked about developing programs," my nephew David added, "we thought you meant organizing support groups or therapy sessions. We didn't realize you were creating policies that affected hundreds of thousands of veterans." The most difficult conversation came with my brother Miguel, the Vietnam veteran whose letters had first inspired me to pursue military service. He had struggled with what we now knew was PTSD for decades after his return from Vietnam, but had never received adequate treatment for his psychological injuries. "Maria," he said, pulling me aside during the reception, "are you telling me that while I was struggling with nightmares and flashbacks for 30 years, you were developing the programs that could have helped me?" "Miguel, the programs I developed are available now. They can still help you. It's never too late to get treatment for combat trauma." "But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you explain what you were doing so we could understand and support you?" It was the question I had been dreading and the one that was most difficult to answer honestly. "Because you saw me as damaged by the war, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap between that perception and what I was actually accomplishing. It was easier to let you maintain your understanding than to constantly defend my choices." The revelation at David's graduation ceremony transformed my family relationships in ways that were both wonderful and complicated. Extended family members who had pitied me for decades suddenly wanted to hear detailed stories about my career. Relatives who had spoken about me in whispers began introducing me to their friends as our family's hero. But the most meaningful change was in my relationship with the younger generation of family members, who began to see my life as an example of what was possible rather than as a cautionary tale about the costs of unconventional choices. My great-niece Elena, David's younger sister, began asking questions about military service, about medical careers, and about the possibility of combining public service with professional achievement. "Tia Maria," she said during a family dinner 6 months after the graduation ceremony, "I want to study public health so I can work on programs that help people the way you did. Can you tell me about how you decided to dedicate your life to serving others?" The conversation that followed was unlike any I had ever had with family members, focused on the intersection of professional calling and social service, on the satisfaction that comes from work that improves other people's lives, and on the different ways that success and fulfillment can be achieved. 2 years later, when Elena graduated from high school and announced that she was planning to study public health with a focus on veteran care, the family response was completely different from what I had experienced 50 years earlier. Instead of concerns about unconventional choices and uncertain career prospects, there were thoughtful questions about the best academic programs, practical discussions about preparation for government service, and obvious pride in having another family member choosing to serve others through professional dedication. "Elena is following in Maria's footsteps," my mother said with obvious pride, choosing a career that will allow her to help people and serve her country. The contrast with my own experience was stark and gratifying. Elena would pursue her calling with family support and understanding, without having to choose between authenticity and acceptance, without having to defend her choices to people who couldn't appreciate their significance. 3 years after the graduation ceremony, I was invited to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for my contributions to veteran mental health care. The ceremony was held at the White House, with my entire extended family invited to witness the recognition of achievements they now understood and celebrated. In my acceptance remarks, I spoke about the intersection of personal calling and public service, about the satisfaction that comes from work that improves other people's lives, and about the importance of supporting family members who choose unconventional paths of service. "The work I have had the privilege of doing," I concluded, "would not have been possible without the foundation of values that my family provided: dedication to serving others, commitment to helping people in need, and the understanding that the highest calling in life is to use whatever talents you have been given to ease suffering and improve the world around you." After the ceremony, at the reception held in the White House East Room, my grandmother approached me with obvious emotion. At 95, she had insisted on making the difficult journey to Washington because, she said, she needed to witness this recognition of achievements she had finally learned to understand and appreciate. "Mija," she said, taking my hands in hers, "I want to ask your forgiveness for all the years we failed to see what you were accomplishing. We worried about you being alone, but we didn't realize that you were never alone because you were surrounded by the thousands of people whose lives you were saving. Abuela, you see clearly now. That's what matters. No, what matters is that you never stopped serving, even when we didn't understand. What matters is that you followed your calling despite our failure to support you. What matters is that you became a healer of the highest order while we were worried about conventional success." As I look back on the journey that brought me from East Los Angeles teenager to Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, I'm struck by how different the story might have been if my family had understood from the beginning what I was trying to accomplish through military service and veteran care. But I'm also grateful for the lesson that their initial lack of understanding taught me, that the most important validation comes from within, from the knowledge that you're using your talents in service to others, regardless of whether that service is recognized or appreciated by those closest to you. The work I have had the privilege of doing, treating combat trauma in Vietnam, developing mental health policies for the entire military medical system, creating PTSD treatment programs that have saved thousands of lives, has been its own reward, independent of family approval or social recognition. But having that approval and recognition now, after decades of working without it, feels like a gift that makes all the difficult moments worthwhile. Today, when young people in my family ask about pursuing careers that might challenge traditional expectations, they're encouraged to follow their callings with confidence that their families will support them, even if the path isn't immediately understood. They know that service can take many forms, that achievement doesn't always fit conventional categories, and that the greatest honor comes from using whatever talents God has given you to ease suffering and improve the lives of others. They know that sometimes the people who worry about us most are the ones who understand us least, but that doesn't make our calling any less valid or our service any less valuable. Most importantly, they know that survival itself is a form of strength, that healing others can be a way of healing yourself, and that the work of service is always worth pursuing, regardless of whether others can see its value. If my story resonates with you today, if you've ever been misunderstood because of your struggles or had your strength questioned because of your wounds, I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by others' perceptions. The work you're called to do, the service you can provide, the healing you can bring, these have value regardless of who recognizes them. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with being underestimated because of your challenges. Have you ever had to prove your strength to people who only saw your struggles? How did you find the courage to keep serving when others questioned your capabilities? And if you know someone who needs to hear this message about finding strength in survival, please share this story with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding purpose in pain, about the courage it takes to serve despite being misunderstood, and about the healing that comes when families learn to see strength where they once saw brokenness. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes the strongest among us are the ones others mistake for broken, but that doesn't make our contributions any less vital or our service any less heroic.